When I read The True American, which I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone in this room, but Toole described it at high level, white meth head who decides his gift to the American people after 9/11 is to kill Arabs, having never seen an Arab, goes after South Asians, and is effective with two misses, shoots the third Bangladeshi immigrant who ends up pleading for mercy using Sharia law while the guy's on death row. It's a true American story. The imagination, the empathy, the love with which you shared that story was extraordinary. When I read that, Anand, when I'm listening to your words here, when I read and then saw the Aspen speech, this idea of duality, of separation, I wonder how connected it is from both the policy level as well as the spiritual level to what you're seeing with inequality and capitalism as it is now. Is it too separate, and what do we need to do as a world to make it more integrated?
Is what separate?
Capitalism and inequality.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is that I think if you kind of step back and look historically, we live in these very big swings. And so right now we're in a very market-loving swing, right? And up to kind of Thatcher and Reagan, you could say we were in a very market-hating swing. And each of these swings is kind of excessive. And I think if you're the kind of person who always thinks the same idea, regardless of what swing you're in, then you're a crazy person. But I think if you don't recognize that sometimes you're in an era with a consensus that is breaking, it's also problematic. So right now, I would say we are in an era, in part because of the Cold War and how it kind of ended in a one-sided victory, in part because of globalization, in part because of India and China coming onto the capitalist stream and loving it and making a lot of money for everybody and themselves. We're in a moment where there's not a really great outsider opposition to capitalism. There's not a smart opposition to it. And so you see different manifestations of that, which is Scotland trying to become its own country, which is not a practical thing, but is some sort of visceral, like, get me out of this thing. And then you see Greece doing what it did, another kind of tanking into the ground. You see this guy who just won in Britain,
Jeremy Corbyn,
who's probably not like a practical vote of who people want to lead Britain, but it's some kind of like, screw you vote. You see Bernie Sanders here, who is probably less of a crazy figure than Jeremy Corbyn, but by American standards, to have a declared socialist polling there's something going on where pretty significant numbers of people, and if you look at the Bernie Sanders crowds, these are not like radical leftists. This is like middle America showing up.
But is it a generational divide? When I look at the young leaders and where they are, I don't feel that they're sitting in the midst of it's all about the market.
So no one says it's all about the market, but the way these consensus work is that people who seem to disagree actually share underlying premises that they don't question. So you have Hillary Clinton, who's running on a pretty strong, just to stay with the politics example, pretty strong, to the left of her 2008 campaign. You have Jeb Bush, right? If you look at their underlying view of how much the market and capitalism today needs to be reined in, their real deep underlying view, it's not that different. When Hillary makes $100 million in 10 years after office, it's hard to believe that she really has a fundamentally different view in her gut of the propriety of this system. And so a lot of the people working on the great causes of the world and on poverty, whatever, are still, although they're in a different place on that spectrum, the entire spectrum is kind of within the safe confines of not questioning the market motive.
Let me push a little bit that in many ways, at the same time that this may be correct, at the same time, the world has never talked more about inequality. We're thinking about inequality in a very deep way. I would argue that every one of these fellows has come to Acumen to dedicate a year of their lives both to look at new economic models in old industries often, where they don't have a lot of wiggle room to try to take the tools of capitalism to extend it into the future. hard to do. And so, in a way, is it almost a distraction that we talk about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton? There's another whole conversation going on. When I look at even Syria, the government policymakers aren't doing a very good job. Individual citizens, their generation, our generation of young people at Acumen, and as metaphor, are taking action in a different way, creating new kinds of systems. And how does that fit in? What are you seeing in the world?
I agree. So I fully agree with that. And I think whether it's, this kind of peer-to-peer things, or there's a whole bunch of models being invented within business, within kind of the aid world, that are new models that are great. And we were just talking about M-Pesa a moment ago. I mean, there's no question that there's great stuff happening within that system, right? But you look at the Syria thing, and you say, the Germans decided by, the flip of the signing of a pen to accept 800,000 people. That's a lot of people. And I think part of what the kind of current zeitgeist doesn't understand is the kind of power of that old fuddy-duddy thing called the law and government and systems. Maybe those things were a little too fashionable before, but I think they're a little too unfashionable now. And a lot of this peer-to-peer stuff is great, but a government saying 800,000 people are welcome or not welcome is big, heavy stuff. And I think if there's a blind spot in our consensus, it's about the power of the law and the power of these systems. And there's a little too much faith, in my view, in self-regulation, which puts a lot of trust in fallible people.